Voices, footsteps, doors opening and closing. And you can just feel it at times. This can feel palpable. Beneath the worn floorboards of a centuries-old farmhouse in Rhode Island, something far stranger than creaks and drafts was waiting. The world knows it as the Conjuring House, famous, feared, and endlessly debated. But for all the stories you've heard, some details were too unsettling to reach the big screen until now. Behind the legends, deeper truths lie buried, and not just in the history books. What began with gentle whispers and the scent of flowers soon twisted into something no one could ignore. One child heard it, another saw it, but it's what they never found that still haunts them. Is the scariest part of the story the spirits or the silence left in their wake? The answers may not scream, but they echo. The house before the Perrons. Long before the Perron family moved into the now infamous farmhouse in Harrisville, Rhode Island, the property, known as the Old Arnold Estate, had already amassed a grim reputation. Historical documents and local folklore combined to paint a disturbing portrait of a series of tragic events that occurred on or near the estate. These include 2 life-ending hangings, and 1 by poison, 2 drownings, and the deaths of 4 men who reportedly froze to death. Additionally, there is mention of bleep and slaying of an 11-year-old girl named Prudence Arnold by a farmhand. However, it's important to note that Prudence's death occurred in Uxbridge, Massachusetts, not on the Arnold estate itself, though the story is often mistakenly linked to the property. The estate was home to 8 generations of the Arnold family, during which time numerous deaths occurred under various circumstances. One notable case is that of Mrs. John Arnold, who, at the age of 93, reportedly hanged herself in the barn. Although these deaths are documented, skeptics suggest that the pattern of misfortune might be coincidental or distorted through generations of retelling. These interpretations highlight how oral history can sometimes blur the line between fact and folklore, especially when amplified by local superstition and evolving community memory. In addition, Bathsheba Sherman was accused of witchcraft and child slaying in the 19th century, complicating the folklore around the estate. Most of the stories tie her up with the Arnold estate, but historical records suggest that Bathsheba lived on an adjoining farm, evidenced by no direct connections to the house itself. Although fictitious, her account added to the lore of the house mainly due to its sensational flavor and fear, imposed on successive generations, of which has been fueled by her presentation in the popular horror film The Conjuring, 2013. It would be the estate history under scrutiny from critics of the paranormal and enthusiasts lately. Adversaries speak against the supernatural claims, as they believe that the ghost histories surrounding the estate have been dramatized by Hollywood and whetted by the appetite of the public for stories of the supernatural, while others are convinced that there were unexplained phenomena found within the past of the property. Whatever one's opinion, however, the old Arnold estate continues to arouse controversy, lying at the junction of historical misfortune and ethereal legend. When the next family arrived, the house wasn't done writing its story, the Perron's first days. When the Perron family, Roger, Caroline, and their 5 daughters, moved into the Arnold estate in Harrisville, Rhode Island in January 1971, they were captivated by the property's rustic charm and sprawling 8.5-acre landscape. The colonial-era farmhouse, with its 14 rooms and antiquated beauty, seemed perfect for the peaceful rural life they had envisioned. But their dreams of pastoral serenity were soon challenged by unsettling oddities that emerged within days of their arrival. A neighbor's parting words, "Leave the lights on at night," initially seemed eccentric, but would later feel ominously prescient. During their first weeks in the house, the family encountered odd but seemingly harmless disturbances. Objects shifted from their original places, tools and household items vanished and reappeared inexplicably, and doors opened or closed without visible cause. Caroline was especially puzzled by her broom-moving locations and small dirt piles forming in newly cleaned areas, an inconvenience that quickly became a recurring pattern. Even their dog, usually fearless, refused to approach certain parts of the house, particularly the cellar door, as if instinctively sensing something the humans could not. Ranging in age and varied temperament, the children began to see things that by any sane standard of judgment should not exist. Their little daughter, Cindy, was always a target. One moment she would put a thing down, and the next it would be in another place, thus giving way to confusion and arguments. The nights grew heavy in tension, with whispers back and forth in the halls and the sound of distant footsteps on wooden floors. The girls increasingly sought out each other's comfort, often sharing a bed when fear loomed too large. Andrea Perron, the eldest daughter, would recollect awakening to her sister's frightened weeping, a sobering comment on the encroaching dread within the home. For some time, rationalizations applied by the family began to wear thin. What had once been seen as idiosyncrasies of an old house began to seem deliberate and charged with intent. Early disturbances set the stage for escalating and more hostile paranormal activity to come. What began as a sheer move to a beautiful rural place had plunged them into a horrifying, tangled wilderness of strange and unexplained happenings. For the parents, their early days at the Arnold estate signified not an opening chapter, but the prologue to an avalanche of haunting they never really planned to deal with. The benevolent spirits of Harrisville. In the early weeks after the Perron family settled into the Arnold estate in Harrisville, Rhode Island, the atmosphere in the house was peculiar, but not immediately threatening. The 5 Perron daughters, Andrea, Nancy, Christine, Cindy, and April, soon began reporting encounters with what they described as nurturing and invisible presences. These entities, which they came to regard as caretakers, behaved in ways that seemed oddly affectionate. According to Andrea, the eldest, one particular spirit would visit the girls at bedtime, gently tucking them in and placing a kiss on their foreheads. At first, Cindy Perron mistook the nightly visitor for their mother until she noticed the distinct scent left behind, a pleasant aroma of fruit and flowers, noticeably different from their mother's familiar fragrance of ivory soap. These interactions were unlike the terrifying experiences typically associated with hauntings. The children sensed a quiet attentiveness, as though the house itself, or something within it, was watching over them. Occasionally their toys were relocated, not violently flung, but simply placed elsewhere, almost playfully. Doors creaked open on their own, and whispers carried through empty rooms. Yet there was no malice in these phenomena. Andrea later reflected that, at the time, it felt as though they were sharing their home with spirits who simply wished to coexist. The benign nature of these early encounters contributed to a false sense of security within the house. Even the family dog seemed aware of the unseen inhabitants of the house. He would avoid certain rooms and be cautious in some areas, but there was no sign of panic then, a reaction that would later become typical for him. The Perrons came to see these entities as echoes of the past, perhaps the spirits of previous occupants, or the guardians of the land who chose to stay behind. Early encounters, which focused mainly on the children, indeed created an odd but comforting rhythm in the household, wherein supernatural events were quietly acknowledged and accepted as a part of daily life. This peaceful coexistence, however, did not last. Andrea Perron would later suggest that spirits they once viewed as protectors may have been overthrown or chased away by something much more sinister. It was long before the comforting events turned into terror, filled with displays of rage, emotional torture, and everything in between. The family's journey would bear witness to a striking contrast in the demarcation between gentle watchers and malicious forces. Yet, for a short time that lingered fondly in memory, the Perrons inhabited a house where the supernatural felt oddly sympathetic. a haunting not of horror, but of muted affection and unseen guardianship. 7 soldiers in the walls. One of the most chilling moments during the Perron family's haunting unfolded when young Cindy Perron confided in her sister Andrea about a cryptic and disturbing message. Cindy claimed to have heard disembodied voices whispering that 7 dead soldiers are buried in the walls. Unlike the earlier ghostly occurrences, this statement carried a disturbing specificity that deeply unsettled the entire family. It wasn't merely the content of the message, it was the clarity with which it was delivered and the eerie confidence Cindy had in its truth. This marked a psychological shift in their understanding of the haunting, suggesting not just the presence of ghosts, but of a dark history woven directly into the structure of their home. The idea that human remains could be interred within the walls of the house cast a sinister shadow over the family's perceptions of their surroundings. Rhode Island's long and complicated colonial past, coupled with its role in early American conflicts, lent just enough plausibility to the claim to make it horrifying. The notion that these spirits could be remnants of war, restless and possibly vengeful, intensified the fear that was already growing inside the house. This wasn't just a haunted location, it was beginning to seem like a burial ground disguised as a farmhouse. Cindy's emotional and psychological response to the experience was a clear indication of just how serious the effect was. She grew noticeably more nervous and withdrawn, tortured by a nagging fear that left her many nights awake. The hushed discovery hung around in her mind, bringing a constant sense of dread that crept into every aspect of her life. Her siblings as well started experiencing a palpable change in her demeanor, something that contributed further to the existing tension in the household. It wasn't mere fantasy for this family. There was a message being conveyed to them, possibly a trigger of the sinister developments that would then unfold. No physical proof was ever discovered to validate the presence of any remains in the walls, but the psychological harm had already been inflicted. Cindy's ordeal and the emotional burden it brought helped create the lasting legend of the Arnold estate. Even in the absence of concrete evidence, the tale of the 7 soldiers became one of the more eerie stories in the Perron's inheritance, fueling the idea that the house was not so much haunted by lost souls as occupied by ancient tragedies waiting to be recognized. Bathsheba Thayer. Bathsheba Sherman, born Bathsheba Thayer in 1812 in Rhode Island, has become one of the most polarizing figures tied to the Conjuring House legend. Popular accounts amplified by the film The Conjuring describe her as a diabolical figure, a woman who allegedly sacrificed her infant to Satan and cursed her land before taking her own life. However, this characterization stems more from folklore than from documented history. Bathsheba was, in fact, a real person who married a farmer named Judson Sherman and lived in the Harrisville area. The couple had children, including a son named Herbert, and endured several personal tragedies, including the premature deaths of some of their children, an unfortunate but common occurrence in the 19th century. The most persistent legend surrounding Bathsheba centers on the mysterious death of a child she was said to be caring for. Allegedly, the child died under suspicious circumstances, with a medical examination revealing a puncture wound at the base of the skull. Though the evidence was circumstantial, Bathsheba quickly became the target of local suspicion and gossip. The community's growing fear and mistrust, rooted in superstition and grief, transformed her into a figure of dread. Despite never being formally accused or tried in court, the lack of legal resolution allowed the accusations to fester and evolve into stories of occultism and malevolence. Eventually, her name was linked to other aspects of New England's sordid past. Others alleged that she was a relative of Maritown Eastay, one of the women hanged during the Salem witch trials, and this solidified her image as a haunted woman. This genealogical link cannot be verified in the records, though, and historians are doubtful about its authenticity. Bathsheba's presentation in contemporary media as an evil spirit has only served to solidify a mythologized account of her life, which has little to do with the recorded facts. The actual woman, to the best of our knowledge, was a problematic but not exceptional woman, far removed from the malevolent entity she's been accused of becoming. Over the past few decades, scholars and local historians have attempted to put some balance back into Bathsheba's tale. By examining public records, burial records, and property records closely, researchers have discovered no solid evidence connecting her to any crime, let alone witchcraft. Although the Perron family did experience what they thought was a supernatural presence, blaming those occurrences on Bathsheba might be more about legend-making than fact. Her reputation, now suspended between fact and frightening fiction, is a study in how actual individuals can be reshaped by rumor, fear, and the long-lasting power of a ghost story. While the truth about Bathsheba remains debated, one woman inside that house began living her own nightmares. A mother under siege. In the early 1970s, Carolyn Perron, the matriarch of the Perron family, began to experience increasingly disturbing and personal encounters within the Harrisville farmhouse. What started as vague, almost dismissible occurrences, creaks in the floorboards, items disappearing, and unexplained drafts, quickly evolved into more alarming episodes. Carolyn awoke with deep bruises on her body that she couldn't explain, and she repeatedly described the unsettling sensation of being watched, especially while in the bedroom. Most haunting of all were her visions of a spectral woman believed to be Bathsheba Sherman, who stood ominously at the foot of her bed, uttering threats laced with malice. These experiences set her apart from the rest of the family, who were encountering paranormal activity in a more general sense. As the supernatural events intensified, so did their toll on Carolyn's physical and psychological well-being. She became increasingly fatigued, disoriented, and emotionally strained. Her health declined, marked by an unexplained depression and sporadic injuries that had no logical source. Her behavior changed as well, worrying her husband, Roger, who began to fear that the house was affecting his wife on a far deeper level. In desperation, he reached out to famed paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren. When the couple arrived, Lorraine, a self-described clairvoyant, immediately identified a dark presence focused on Carolyn, and warned that she may be the central target of the oppressive force inhabiting the home. The ultimate peak of Carolyn's tribulation was during a séance held in the basement of the house by Warren. The séance was not quick to bring about anything within anyone's control, but was drawn directly against the entity. It is reported by Andrea Perron, who fortuitously saw the entire event, that, by some force, her mother seemed taken over. Carolyn began speaking in a language not recognizable to Andrea. Her voice was twisted and very unearthly. After a few moments, her chair was lifted into the air and subsequently thrown brutally around the room. According to Roger, the experience was frightening enough for him to demand an immediate closure of the session, along with the Warrens' exit, as their presence made the situation worse, not better. With the trauma, the Perrons stayed in that house for roughly 10 more years, without the means to buy another home. Obviously, Carolyn, who had borne the heaviest brunt of the haunting, would bear lifelong emotional and psychological scars. She referred to the house as a portal cleverly disguised as a farmhouse, meaning it was a crossing point for dark energies, dark even beyond human comprehension. The experience, indeed, brought in a very personal element into the tragedy of the Perron family, making it from a strange haunting into something much more malignant on a really human level. The séance gone wrong. In the fall of 1973, the Perron family's haunting reached a disturbing crescendo when Ed and Lorraine Warren visited their Harrisville home and proposed a séance to confront the increasingly hostile supernatural activity. The session was specifically intended to target the dark force believed to be afflicting Carolyn Perron. Lorraine, a clairvoyant, claimed to sense that something malevolent had attached itself to Carolyn and was feeding off her energy. Although the family had previously endured strange and terrifying phenomena, the decision to directly engage the entity through spiritual means marked a dramatic escalation in their response to the haunting. Andrea Perron, the eldest daughter, disobeyed orders to stay upstairs and secretly watched the séance unfold from a hidden spot nearby. What she witnessed would haunt her for the rest of her life. According to her account, as the ritual progressed, her mother suddenly began to speak in a language no one recognized. Her voice contorted and filled with rage. Moments later, Carolyn's chair lifted off the ground and hurled her across the basement. The violence of the moment shattered any remaining doubt that something unnatural was occurring. Andrea described the scene as horrifying and feared, even as a child, that her mother might be lost for good in that instant. Lorraine Warren, who had public actions concerning the issue and rarely discussed the specifics of what was witnessed, confirmed sensing a strong and evil force entity, yet she did not reveal the details of the séance. Now, speculation as to silence. Was it too traumatic to be recalled? Or were there things even the Warrens didn't understand? Paranormalists and skeptics alike question this. How an event that important and well-documented can be so hazy, yet the mystery holds. Vivid reports of more ghost events in the said house after the séance, but the worst of them seem to have abated. The Perrons, therefore, remained under one roof until 1980, still hampered by financial constraints. The hauntings may not have ended, but the séance certainly had a major implication on the plotline at that point, an implication that would later shape the public narrative of the family. Andrea Perron went on to record this entire and varied experience into her memoir series, House of Darkness, House of Light, a narration that gives a very personal and detailed perspective. Certainly, the séance itself is shrouded by mystery and fear, one of the most debatable and scary turns in all of the Conjuring House mythology, the real hide-and-clap incident. Among the many eerie episodes experienced by the Perron family, one incident involving a seemingly innocent game of hide-and-seek left a lasting psychological imprint, especially on young Cindy Perron. During one afternoon, Cindy chose to hide in a wooden pine box stored in the family's barn. The box had no visible lock or latch and appeared to be a harmless, if dusty, hiding spot. Once inside, however, Cindy found herself inexplicably trapped. No matter how hard she pushed or kicked, the lid refused to budge. Panic set in as she screamed for help, but her cries were swallowed by the silence of the barn. Cindy remained inside the sealed box for nearly 20 minutes until her sister Nancy found her and opened it with ease, an action that seemed to defy the box's earlier stubbornness. What made the episode even more unnerving was the absence of any mechanical reason the lid should have stayed shut. Cindy was adamant that she hadn't closed it tightly, and there was no internal latch. To the family, and especially to the girls, the incident felt like far more than a childhood misadventure. In a house already pulsing with unexplained sounds and invisible presences, this moment stood out as disturbingly deliberate. The effect on Cindy was immediate and intense. What should have been a joyous, carefree day turned into an event seared in the family's psyche, which would simply heighten its fears of the house. Innocent games, such as hide-and-seek, were no longer games. They appeared too risky, even threatening. For the Perron children, home began to be a place where the house was toying with them by manipulating their routines and skewing their perceptions of safety. The incident fueled Carolyn and Roger's growing concerns, increasing their seriousness about the children's experiences and strengthening their resolve to seek outside help for them. But skeptics will view it through a glass as just another unfortunate incident of a collapsing timber or coincidence of a house growing old. The event itself casts a longer shadow in the context of a whole range of unexplained experiences, moving things, disembodied voices, sudden cold drafts, and disturbing dreams. To take Cindy's entrapment as mere coincidence would require speculation beyond the given context. What was an innocent game could even turn sinister in that home. The hide-and-clap scene played out in The Conjuring had germinated from something far more personal and chillingly real. The Perrons after the house. Years after escaping the relentless haunting at the Arnold estate, the Perron family continued to believe that the dark energy tied to their former home, and specifically the spirit of Bathsheba Sherman, had not let them go. Andrea Perron, the eldest daughter, has publicly shared stories of lingering paranormal activity affecting her family long after they left Harrisville. These reports weren't limited to memories or dreams. They included tangible disturbances that convinced the family they were still being targeted, even as they tried to rebuild their lives elsewhere. Strange and unsettling experiences followed them like a shadow. One particularly alarming incident occurred in 2012 during the production of The Conjuring, the Hollywood dramatization of their story. While Andrea and her sisters visited the film set in Wilmington, North Carolina, a sudden and violent gust of wind swept across the location, toppling lighting rigs, scattering equipment, and halting production. At that same moment, miles away in Georgia, Caroline Perron, who had opted not to join the set visit, fell in her home and broke her hip. The family was rattled by the eerie timing and saw it as more than a coincidence. When informed of the chaos on set, Caroline reportedly whispered, "Bathsheba does not want to be exposed." For the Perrons, this was not a solitary aberration. Andrea has outlined other incidents through the years: objects mysteriously moving, temperatures dropping in a closed room, and an overriding feeling of being watched by an invisible presence. These experiences cemented their view that the presence they met at Rhode Island was greater than a ghost confined to the house. For them, Bathsheba had linked herself to them on a more profound, even spiritual level, and kept reminding them of her existence, regardless of how far they went or how long the passage of time. To this day, the Perron family's tale provokes strong responses, both from believers in residual hauntings and from skeptics who question such assertions. The Perrons themselves, however, experienced the terror, not as it was finally mercifully ended at the closure of the Arnold estate for the last time. The movie took only a snapshot of their initial experience, but their own haunting persisted in more subtle, quieter forms. Their tale is a cold reminder that, to some, the past won't stay in the ground, and that whatever they faced in that dusty old farmhouse may have accompanied them for their entire lives. Compounding the Perrons' faith is the psychological post-traumatic haunting, wherein severe stress and emotional trauma can become a lingering supernatural awareness. As parapsychologist Dr. Barry Tafe has observed in an interview, sometimes it's not the house that's haunted, it's the people, meaning unresolved fear and trauma can attach themselves to individuals and influence their understanding of new settings in uncanny fashion. Just as the Perrons tried to move on, someone else unknowingly stepped into the story's next twist. A new era at the Conjuring House. When Norma Sutcliffe and her husband, Jerry Helfrich, purchased the Arnold estate in 1987, they had no idea they were inheriting one of the most infamous reputations in paranormal history. For years, the couple lived quietly on the property, appreciating its colonial charm and rural tranquility. But that peace was shattered in 2013 with the release of The Conjuring. Practically overnight, their home transformed from a private residence into a public obsession. Fans, ghost hunters, and curiosity seekers began flocking to the property, some even trespassing at night. What had once been their sanctuary became a stage for the world's fascination with the supernatural. Though Sutcliffe has described herself as a skeptic, she hasn't completely dismissed the strange things she's experienced over the years. She's admitted to hearing unexplained footsteps, disembodied voices, and seeing lights flicker without cause. However, she believes these occurrences can likely be explained by natural phenomena, aging infrastructure, or psychological suggestion. Unlike the Perrons who viewed the house as spiritually active, Sutcliffe has tried to approach each incident with rational inquiry. Still, she couldn't ignore the very real impact the film had on her privacy and safety. In frustration, she filed a lawsuit against Warner Brothers, claiming the studio used her home's likeness without consent, prompting security risks and emotional distress. Resolved to distinguish sensationalized fiction from fact, Sutcliffe did extensive research into the history of the property. She collaborated with local journalists and historians to investigate the actual events surrounding the Perron haunting and challenged many of the assertions made in both the film and Andrea Perron's books. Her research indicated that, although the house did indeed have a long and sometimes tragic past, much of the alleged hauntings had no credible evidence. Instead of ruling out the Perrons' experiences as impossible, Sutcliffe suggested that memory, trauma, and folklore could have been a major factor in creating what they experienced. In 2019, the property was sold again, this time to Corey and Jennifer Heinsohn, a husband and wife team of paranormal investigators. Unlike Sutcliffe, the Heinsohns welcomed the home's reputation as haunted and opened it to the public for overnight stays and tours. Whereas they, as well, have professed to see inexplicable action, their management of the house indicates a larger cultural trend, one in which the distinction between myth and advertisement has weakened. Norma Sutcliffe's contribution to the history of the Conjuring House differs not because it tells spooky stories, but because it demands fact, proof, and sense, providing an earthy view amid a sea of supernaturalism. To this counter-narrative is added the account of documentary filmmaker Kendall Welpton, co-director of The Sleepless Unrest, a 2021 documentary in which he and his team lived for 2 weeks within the Conjuring House. Welpton, even though he approached the project with a more observational approach, pointed out that there was a heaviness in the air that never really left. He was adamant that though they did not get clear evidence of spirits, the psychological impact of being within the house, especially during the still early morning hours, could not be denied. This reflects larger trends within paranormal tourism, where experiences tend to combine environmental tension with personal expectation. The cultural interest in the house has spread beyond the Perron family story to become an experiential event where belief, fear, and folklore converge. This broadening of viewpoint implies that the history of the Conjuring House is no longer merely about what occurred, about what individuals bring with them whenever they enter its premises. Thanks for watching. If this story gave you chills, hit that like button. Drop a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more eerie tales from history's darkest corners. And if you're brave enough, stick around and click the next video on your screen, if you dare.